everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and I'm coming to you from inside my garage to discuss UV filters. Why am I in my garage? Well, I'm going to show you that in a moment. Now, keeping a UV filter on your lens is one of those topics that really fires up the debate among photographers, with each side thinking the other is crazy. Most people tend to be solidly in one camp or another, and I'll tell you where I personally land at the end of this video. Now, the biggest problem, I think, with UV filter discussions is most statements are made based on assumptions, anecdotal evidence, or even hearsay. So, rather than just add my own opinions and assumptions, I decided to put everything to the test, and I think you're in for a few surprises. In fact, I know I was. We're going to finally answer questions like, do you need a UV filter with a digital camera? Is there a sharpness difference when using UV filters? Are they more prone to flare? Is it really cheap insurance for your lens? Are they worth the hassle? And most importantly, do they really protect your lens? You'll definitely want to stick around for that one. I actually go out and bust up a bunch of lenses and filters to determine just how much protection they really offer. Like I say, I'm going to put everything to the test this time. So let's go ahead and get started. 1. Do you need to filter out UV light? Now, once upon a time, back in the film days, it was actually necessary to use a UV filter to eliminate UV haze. Film could see a blue UV haze that was invisible to our eyes, and it had a nasty habit of showing us that ugly blue haze when we got our prints back. With digital and even some modern film, this is not an issue anymore. Just look at these two photos taken with my D810. The color is identical, no blue haze in the filtered or the unfiltered version. So, for all practical purposes, you don't need a UV filter to cut out UV haze anymore, especially if you shoot digital. The only reason you would really put one on is for protection purposes. 2. Does it impact image quality? Okay, so what about image quality degradation? A lot of people say, you know what, I don't want to put a cheap piece of glass in front of my expensive lens. And that's a valid point. But with even a mid-range filter, there's really not much of a hit in the image quality department. To prove it, check out these sample photos. One is with a Tiffin UV filter, and the other is just the naked lens. Now, there are better filters and brands in that than this Tiffin I'm using, to be sure, and if I was using one of these all the time, I'd probably pick a higher-end Hoya or BW filter that would no doubt perform even better. However, even our relatively inexpensive Tiffin filter does a great job. Now, there's a very slight difference in sharpness, but it's really tough to see, and nothing a little sharpening during post-processing can't fix. And the file sizes of the images also agree. The unfiltered file is slightly larger than the filtered one, and this is generally the sign of more detail in a file, assuming the shots are identical. It's only about 2% larger, so not a big difference. Here's another sample. Again, virtually no difference in sharpness or quality. Feel free to check these images out for yourself at my website at this link right here. Now, there is an area where the UV filter can hurt you, and that's in the lens flare department. It's possible to get more flare with the filter attached than not, so if you're shooting into a direct light source, it's a good idea to go ahead and remove that filter. As a side note, you can also get ghosting if you're shooting at night when the back of the UV filter picks up a reflection from the front element of your lens. Again, the best idea is if there's a bright point source of light in your image, just unscrew the filter. 3. Is it cheap insurance? When it comes to UV filters, one statement that gets tossed around a lot is that it's quote-unquote cheap insurance. Usually it's something like, I'd rather lose a $50 filter than a $2,000 lens. Well, here's the thing. The filter is really only offering some protection for the front element of the lens, and hey, lenses can be repaired. You don't have to buy a whole new lens just because your front element gets a little bit messed up or scratched or something. Of course, a new front element isn't free, but you know, it's not crazy either. I made a couple calls for my Nikon 24-70 2.8 and found the cost of replacing the front element on that particular lens was between $300 and $350. Not cheap, but certainly not the cost of a new $1,900 lens. Obviously, the cost will vary from lens to lens, and honestly, for cheaper lenses, the repair may even outweigh the cost of a new lens. However, my point is that a damaged front element does not necessarily make the lens a throwaway or even unreasonable to repair. One last thought. If you have a lot of lenses and are buying a bunch of high-quality filters, the cost in filters could easily exceed the expense of repair, depending on the lenses, of course. So you have to weigh the expense versus the protection, and we're going to see just how much protection these little filters give you here in a minute. 4. Is it worth the hassle? Although it doesn't seem like it, I think UV filters are kind of a hassle. See, when I shoot, I often use a polarizer, and since stacking filters is usually not a good idea, if I'm using a UV filter, I'd have to remove it and then screw in the polarizer. Now, this doesn't sound too difficult, and it's really not. But try juggling a couple of filters, a cable release, your camera, and a tripod while awkwardly balancing in a river. I can promise you that something or someone is going to go for a swim. So when you're using multiple filters, it can be a hassle to switch them back and forth all the time. If you do stack, you risk degrading image quality, not to mention that it can cause vignetting on some lenses. In fact, here's my polarizer and UV filter stacked on my 2470 at 24mm. You can clearly see the vignetting right there in the corners. 5. Does a UV filter really protect the lens? Now this is the big one and probably the main reason you're watching this video. So how much protection does a UV filter really offer? To put that question to the test, I went to my local camera store, Cone Camera and Photo, and I also went to KEH.com, one of my favorite online sources for used gear. I purchased a large variety of UV filters and $5 bargain grade lenses so we could see just what it takes to break this stuff. In order to perform these tests, I built this little lens smashing device. Basically, the shuttle right here drops down between these two pipes, and the drop is about 48.5 inches from the bottom of this 5/16 threaded rod to the base of the unit when it's dropped all the way up here at the top. The top of the threaded rod right here allows me to add weight as needed, and I can do so in 1/4 and 1/2 pound amounts with a set of washers, and I have a 2.5 pound gym weight when I really need to deliver some force. Oh, and the empty shuttle itself right here, that comes in at 1/2 pound. Also, in order to keep the lenses flat on the impact surface, I ground off any extra tabs and such on the bottom since none of them came with lens caps. Also, before we go on, I do want to admit that this is not what I would call an overly scientific test, and of course there are hundreds, really thousands of other lenses and filters that would give varying results. Also, I'm sure there are more precise ways to measure this. However, I think you'll find this does give us a good idea of just what it takes to break a lens or a UV filter. Now, as for the amount of force my little lens smasher here hits with, I don't have any kind of impact force meter at my disposal, but I did want to give you some kind of an idea of what kind of impact this thing was delivering. So I took an ordinary piece of copy paper and found the unweighted shuttle was just able to pop through it at 7 inches from the tip of the shuttle to the paper, this tip right here. Closer drops didn't break through, so hopefully that gives you a rough idea and some frame of reference. Okay, now that we have all the details out of the way, let's go ahead and smash some stuff. We'll do all the tests first, and then I'll go over all the results. The first test I wanted to do was one that would determine just how tough a UV filter really is, and then another test to show how tough a typical lens was. So I decided to start with the UV filters. I began the test at half height with no added weight on the shuttle. I tried 3 different grades of 62mm Pro Master UV filters, and they all cracked. A Nikon 62mm filter cracked, a 52mm BW filter cracked, as well as a Nikon antiphon of the same size. The truth is, I kept thinking that something would survive this initial test, and not a single filter did. So I tried again, this time starting from a short 5-inch drop, convinced that everything could survive that impact since I couldn't even bust through paper at that distance. And it turns out I was wrong. Both a 62mm Pro Master and a 52mm Tiffin filter cracked at that short little drop. I then moved up to 8 inches, which was the breaking point for a Canon 58mm, a BW 52, and a Hoya 52. It took a 13-inch drop to break a Nikon 52mm, and the record was an 18-inch drop for a thick Hoya 67mm. Next, we went to the lenses. Now, I know that when you see this, you may, at least initially, think it's not fair since the front element of the lens sits higher than the filters did. And while this is true, once you see the results, you'll see why, you know what, it doesn't really matter too much. We started all the lenses off at half height with the unweighted shuttle. Not one lens broke, was scratched, or cracked. Not one single filter would have survived that drop, even when you compensate for the added height of the lens. Next, we went all the way to the top and let the unweighted shuttle fly. Again, not a single lens broke, cracked, chipped, or showed any ill effect at all. Again, no UV filter tested would have had any chance at that drop distance. Okay, so now we added some weight. We put 1/4 pound on the shuttle and only 2 lenses broke under the 3/4 pound of combined weight. The little Canon 35-70 zoom and the Sigma 75-300 zoom. Every other lens survived, again, with not so much as a mark on them. So we went to 1/2 pound, bringing the total weight to 1 full pound. This time we lost the Canon 50mm 1/8 and the Nikon 35-80. Next we went to 3/4 pound plus the weight of the shuttle, bringing the total weight to 1 1/4 pounds. This time we lost the Vivitar 28-90 Series 1 and the old JCPenney 70-200 zoom. The second toughest lens was the Osawa 135, which needed 2.5 pounds added for a combined weight of 3 pounds before we could shatter that front element. The hardest lens of the bunch to break was the Canon 70-200 zoom. That one took 3.5 pounds of added weight for a combined weight of nearly 4 pounds. Now, this is all well and good, but it left a serious question. Was the lens plus the UV filter greater than the sum of its parts? For this test, I decided to find the known breaking points of a lens without a UV filter, and then take an identical lens and put a UV filter on the front, hitting it with the same force that was required to break just the lens. The first lens was a 35-70 Canon zoom. This lens broke with a full drop plus 1/4 pound added to the shuttle. So I took an identical lens, added a Hoya UV filter to it, and dropped the same weight on it. Without the UV filter, the front element shattered, and with the UV filter attached, the front element was okay. However, pretty much everything else in the lens was destroyed. Next, I took the 70-200 Canon zoom lens and did the same tests. This lens took a combined 4 pounds to crack the front element. When I added a UV filter and hit an identical lens with the same weight, the front element actually survived with only a small chip. I then added another filter and another 1/2 pound, and I hit it again. And again, the front element survived. However, there is more to it than this, and I'll reveal that info in the conclusions. Finally, I wanted to try a drop test to see if the filter seemed to offer any protection in a drop situation. We tried from various heights, 1 foot apart, until the lens became totally non-functional. We had 2 different lenses for this one, an old JCPenney 70-200 zoom lens and the Sigma 70-300 zoom. A short 2-foot drop was enough to start seeing damage in both lenses. At 3 feet, both lenses had suffered catastrophic internal damage and were no longer functional. I also did a thread test, and I have some interesting results to share about that one in the conclusions. Conclusions. Again, I want to stress this isn't a scientific test. However, I think it's safe to go ahead and draw a few conclusions here. The first is obvious. UV filters break way before lenses do, and I have to admit, I was actually shocked at just how little effort it took to break these filters. Some broke at less of an impact than what it took to break through a piece of paper. Also, there is virtually no correlation between the quality of the brand and what it takes to break the filter. The expensive BW filter was right in the middle of the pack for breakage. So, granted, we didn't test every UV filter and lens in existence, but it's pretty clear that your typical UV filter has a much lower threshold for impact damage than your typical lens does. This makes me think that much of the anecdotal evidence we see where someone shows a broken UV filter and proclaims the filter saved their lens from catastrophic damage is likely incorrect. Based on what I've seen in these tests, I really believe that the vast majority of people who have broken UV filters have simply broken their UV filters and really didn't save their lens at all. I believe that in most cases the filter didn't do anything to save their lens from cracking or breakage. The UV filter simply broke because they are much more prone to breakage than the lens itself is. Additionally, I've seen time and again as I did these tests that in many cases when the lens was impacted, other parts of the lens broke before the front element was damaged. Sometimes it was the zoom mechanism, sometimes an internal element would break, sometimes a focusing ring would fail. Heck, several lenses actually lost the rear element due to the impact, even though the front element was able to withstand the hit. So this makes me think that if your UV filter breaks and the lens still works, then in all likelihood the UV filter really didn't save the lens. In about half the cases, another part of the lens failed before the front element ever cracked. So if the hit was hard enough to bust the lens, the chances are a UV filter wouldn't have helped. As you recall, we did do some tests for this when we smashed the lenses with those UV filters attached. With the Canon 35-70 zoom lens, we found the breaking point of the lens, then attached a UV filter to a second copy of the lens and fired away. The front element survived the impact, but the lens was completely destroyed internally. The UV filter did absolutely nothing to save it. The second UV plus lens test seemed to favor the UV filter as protection, but again, it's not exactly what it appears. In this case, the front element again survived the same amount of force that cracked the bare lens, and it even survived a second hit with another ½ pound attached. However, the UV protected lens and the non-protected lens both suffered internal failure due to the force of the impacts. Now, the protected one didn't seem to have suffered as severely as the non-protected one, but it didn't sustain all those impacts leading up to the final hit either, and in the end, both lenses would have still needed to see the inside of a repair shop. So again, I'm kind of left with the conclusion that if your lens is going to be hit hard enough to break it, at least from a frontal impact point of view, a UV filter seems like it can do very little to stop it. That said, I do believe that it does help spread out the impact a bit, and maybe in a minority of cases it could actually help keep the lens from breaking. However, based on what I've seen with these tests, I still think that for the most part, the protection you get from a UV filter is very minimal, at least when it comes to frontal impacts. Finally, we had the drop test to see if a UV filter helps absorb the shock of a fall. In this case, the UV filter did tend to crack at a 2-foot drop. However, in both drop tests, the lens also started showing signs of failure at that same height. At 3 feet, neither lens was really functional anymore, despite being dropped right on the UV filter. And this makes sense since the UV filter is threaded into the lens and it's not really acting like a shock absorber in any way. After all, if you put a chunk of metal in your hand and smack it with a sledgehammer, it won't do much to dull the pain. Since the filter is threaded directly into the lens, I think the same principle applies. However, there was a bright point in the drop test for the UV filter. We also tested to see if the threads on the lens were damaged at drops of the same height that bent the UV filter. As it turns out, the lens threads did actually bend. So if you have a UV filter on your lens and you drop it, you may save your filter threads, assuming the lens survives the impact. However, be warned that it's sometimes tough to get the bent filter out of the lens threads, and you may still have to send it into the shop in order to remove the damaged filter. Okay, so what does it all mean? Should you just ditch UV filters altogether, or keep them, or what? Now, in my opinion, not necessarily a good idea to completely ditch them. Well, the tests do point to the fact that UV filters don't offer much in breakage protection. They still do offer protection from things like scratches and dust and sand and fingerprints and contamination and that sort of thing. For instance, I like to have a UV filter on when I'm out in the desert and maybe the wind and dust are blowing all around and the sand's blowing. Or when I'm out along the ocean and sea spray splashing up. So I really do think they have their uses. Personally, my choice is to only attach one when needed and leave it off the rest of the time. As a side note, I was also amazed at how cheap these filters are in general when you buy them used. So that's something to consider if you want to save a little cash. Just a little side note there. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that while I don't use UV filters for breakage protection, I do usually have a lens hood attached. I personally think it offers better physical protection of the front element, plus has the handy advantage of keeping out all that stray light. And hey, you probably already have one. I can also say that I've been without UV filter protection for the majority of my 30 years of shooting and have never had a lens get damaged where I think a UV filter would have made any difference. So I guess there you have it. Also, if you enjoyed this video and enjoy practical, real-world photography advice, you'll absolutely love my ebook, Secrets to Stunning Wildlife Photography. It is jam-packed with 290 pages of my very best field-proven advice for wildlife photographers. Please check it out at the link below, and you'll see why thousands of other photographers have already grabbed their copies. Also, a big thank you to everyone who has ordered the book and contributed at the website. Your generosity helps keep these videos coming. Finally, thanks again for watching today. If you have a UV filter opinion, feel free to post it in the comments here or over at my website. Also, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and sign up for my email newsletter. New tips, articles, and videos are always announced to subscribers of my email newsletter first. And hey, it's 100% free, so nothing to lose. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.